So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Joanna Hunt, who I adore and am so happy to have here. Joanna graduated from CW with a BA in English and has been a long-time volunteer focusing on LGBTQ+ and women's rights. Joanna also helps with the Ellensburg Bail Fund that hopes to educate the community on the need for cash bail reform and the inequity of the bail system. It also helps create a fund to give the community assistance with the bail. Joanna feels voting is vital and needs to be protected, and it is just the first of many steps in social and political reform. So hand over the mic to you, Joanna, and let me know if you need anything.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me tonight. A little bit more about myself. I have been pretty politically active all of my life. My mother was very active in volunteering for Planned Parenthood and women's reproductive rights. So I grew up in a household that was very vocal about our rights. And then I came to Central, got my degree, and one of the reasons why my wife and I decided to stay in Ellensburg is you have, as a progressive activist, it's easier to see impact sometimes, especially in a community like ours. And so we wanted to make sure that we were having an impact where we are. And as part of our all civic duty, voting is a first step towards that impact. But I think what some people get maybe bogged down with is that it's not the only step. And there's such a push for voting being so important, which it is. And it is your constitutional right to vote, that we get inundated with to vote or not to vote. And we don't realize that that's step one. That's step one of a very long and sometimes terrible process. And I think this year has been a very large catalyst for why voting is so important. So let's start with, my dear moderator, with a raise of hands for how many of you, is this your first time voting? Just in general, is this your first time casting your ballot? Raise your hand. Just press the hand raise button. I can't see any of you, so I'm just looking at myself and wondering why my forehead is so big in this camera.
I don't think we have any first-time voters.
Ooh, that's so sexy. I love it. Okay, so one of the important things about having the youth vote, and I say that 18 and up college students, is that your votes outnumber the older votes. Why? Because young people outnumber old people. that's just math. Okay, but if your voice didn't matter, voter suppression wouldn't be in such high swing. And when we say voter suppression, we mean any act to suppress voting. For example, limiting the ballot drop boxes to 1 per county in Texas. I don't know if how many of you have been to Houston. I've been to Houston, Texas. 1 ballot drop is not enough. Okay, that is voter suppression. A second one just popped up today. For those of you who don't know what Proud Boys are American neo-Nazis. They're a white supremacist group. And they somehow obtained a Democratic voter registration list. And those voter registration lists include private contacts. And what they were found to be doing was calling and sending letters to registered Democrats in Florida, threatening them with violence if they didn't register as Republicans and vote Republican. That's not only voter suppression, that's using terroristic violence tactics to benefit political parties. So voter suppression is active, it's real, it's happening with groups, it's also happening on governmental levels. So if anyone ever tells you your vote doesn't matter, people wouldn't fight so hard to not let you vote, okay? But again, it's the first step in the process. And what we want to talk about today is how to move from that first step, which is voting and making sure your ballot is filled out correctly, to the next step, which is holding whoever you vote for accountable. And accountability looks a few different ways. So what I want to talk about first is making sure your ballot's filled out correctly. Now, I didn't realize this was such a thing because there are instructions, right? It's not rocket science. But for a lot of people who aren't fortunate, like Washington State, to have mail-in ballots, they literally see 2 envelopes and they don't know what they're doing, right? And it's, but again, with COVID and with the big global impact that we have, a lot of things are different. And so that's why it's important that you take a few seconds, center yourself, gather your thoughts, and read all of the instructions. Read the instructions, read the instructions, read the instructions. It's kind of the same thing with your syllabus. Read the syllabus, then ask me questions, okay? So I'm assuming everybody knows how to do this, but there's an inner and outer envelope. And for those of you, if it doesn't make sense, for me, I like to see how things work, and I have seen how a voting machine takes envelopes apart, so it makes sense. You make sure this is sticking outside of this, right? Goes in the envelope, and then you put it in the mailer envelope, you seal it, you sign it, and you drop it off. Now, we are one of the only colleges that has a ballot box, which is awesome, because then you don't have to pay for a stamp, you don't have to mail it, you don't have to worry about anything. But we have 2 ballot boxes in Ellensburg. One is right out front of the courthouse on Main and 5th, and the other is right out in front of the Cirque. You can't miss it. It's where you buy parking passes, the daily parking passes, out by the cat statue. So make sure that you're properly. I'll drop my ballot off there. Offense. Now, not that saying that means a whole lot, but it is still a federal offense, and most people aren't going to risk messing with the ballot box unless you're illegally planting ballot boxes that aren't real. So only put your ballot in the 2 ballot boxes that are real in Kittitas County, which is courthouse and at the Cirque. Okay, so raise your hand if you did not get your voter's pamphlet. And your voter's pamphlet looks like this. It's like an ugly phone book. No hands?
Not yet.
Love it. Good. You should have received this before you received your ballot. Now, there's a lot of jargon in here. So if there are any questions, if for those of you who have it handy, if you want to flip through it, actually, my wife and I laughed because when you turn to page 14, it has this really ugly like graph, right? And unless you're an economics nerd, most people are like, repeal. There's a lot of math in here. But there's also a lot of information that goes in the ballot. So they don't just say, here, vote on this. The language can be very manipulative, and the wording of a thing is created to sway votes in a particular way, okay? So, for example, I'm not gonna go over the advisory notes because that stuff is really boring, even for me, and I love it. So for Washington State, the way the Washington State legislature is made up is our legislature creates laws. That's the point of the legislature, okay? We vote our legislators in, they create laws. Now, sometimes we vote to approve those laws, or sometimes the legislature just passes them, okay? Again, that's kind of their job. But one thing that's really difficult about Washington State is we are a very progressive state, but we have a very regressive tax bracket system. So that's why there's a lot of millionaires that live in Washington, because they don't have to pay taxes. Okay. And another weird thing about Washington is take from certain portions of the budget if there's like a shortfall. So with COVID and all the businesses shutting down, like, we needed money. Now the government federally has enough money to pay all of us a substantial amount of money and everything be okay. Okay. But for Washington State, if there's a shortfall, we have a lot of money in the budget for the military, but we can't touch it because of our constitution. We can only take money out of social services. like education and healthcare and firemen, right? So it doesn't make sense, but it's the way our Constitution is written. And so a lot of people don't know that. And so the way that certain rules are written, you're like, oh my gosh, this is this big tax increase, or, oh, I can't believe they wrote this in the law. Well, it's the way the system works. And you get a voter's pamphlet once to twice a year. You vote every year. You don't just vote for the president. You know, you'll see if the school board's got a levy. Now, if you're older, you're like, oh yeah, school board levy. As you get older, you're going to see school board levies. I mean, assuming we haven't already been hit by a comet, like you're going to see a school board levy. So it's really, the problem is the voter pamphlet is it's super boring. Like if you could take the voter pamphlet and turn it into a series of TikToks, it would be great because you would get everything you need and it would be a lot of fun. The problem is it's dry as shit, okay? Hey, can't break it down any other way. It's really boring. But that's the devil's in the details, as they say. And so it's really important to go through. And this one's got more pictures than I've ever seen a voter's pamphlet have, but it's done a pretty good job of kind of breaking down what's doing what. And so like, I just go through and make my checks. Here's my checks. I have one page folded over, I'll be honest, and it has to do with, who cares? It's boring. So, but it's really important to read it and understand what the next steps are after you vote, okay? I'm not gonna tell you who to vote for because you're grown-ups. I mean, you should know who to vote for, but you're grown-ups. If you have any questions on some of the more minute, finer details or what the referendums are, or this engrossed Senate Joint Resolution 8212, which is really boring. So if you really wanna spend time on that, ask. But it's all in here and there's a lot of information online. So please make sure that you read that and then make sure that you fill your ballot out properly. And I would like to suggest that each one of you today promise me, and I'm gonna promise you, that I'm gonna turn my ballot in within 48 hours. Okay, so I want all of our ballots. If you haven't already voted, if you've already voted, good job, good for you. If not, let's make sure that our ballots are in by Friday. Okay, let's not wait till the last minute. This isn't, you know, decisions can be made with one ballot. So let's make sure that our ballots are in. We know that they're set. And there we go. I see you voted. Good job. Love it. So let's make sure. Now that's just step one. Okay. Voting is step one of this process. And it's really hard when, for some groups, especially marginalized groups, voting, getting to the ballot box is a battle. And unfortunately, the battle just begins at that point. There's no political party, there's no political system, there's no group that's perfect. I saw a TikTok today, it was like, you're not getting married. This isn't the end. And I was like, yeah, for real, you're not getting married. You're just trying to ride the closest bus that's gonna get you to your house, right? And that, if I could give you that TikTok video right now. So, but it's a really good one. It's about voting third party. Not that I have anything against voting third party, but if they're not one of the two contenders, sometimes it can sway votes from candidates who need it. So that's a different question for a different day. That's just step one. Step two is keeping the fires burning. And I've had this conversation with other students. I was like, if you vote for the Democrats, good. Don't expect them to fix it on their own. And don't expect other parties to roll just because one party won, okay? That's unfortunate, that's not how it works. Life isn't fair, and not all grown-ups behave like grown-ups. So the first thing you do is you keep making phone calls. And I know a lot of youth feel very anxious about making phone calls. I love it, but I also work in customer service, so I make phone calls all the time. I'm gonna have, Megan, will you go ahead and let's pull up the slides for our local reps. And one thing I'd like to talk about, and you guys can screenshot these, you can write them down, is how important it is to hold your local representatives accountable, okay? So here are some of our government leaders. Now, I have met all of these people. Like I said, I do a lot of legislative work. I go to Olympia and I do lobbying. which some of you are like, really? With a mouth like that? You'd be surprised. I can clean up real nice and I can really kind of tone it down. But the thing is, I shouldn't have to, because I'm a constituent. And one thing that I loved to do, especially with Congressman Reichart, is that I would leave him a voicemail every morning while I was going to the bathroom before work. Doesn't sound very sexy, right? It's not very sexy. I'm telling him that he's doing a terrible job serving me as a constituent. And I had him in my phone as Congressman Douchebag Reichart. And I'd click it and I'd leave him a voicemail. Now, you're just like, Joanna, you're just leaving salty voicemails every morning. Yeah. The funny thing about these is they have to log those voicemails. Their aides have to write down, constituent from Kittitas County thinks you're a pain because you keep voting against gay rights. They have to log that. Okay. Emails can sometimes get through, but again, emails sometimes can get lost in the shuffle, or they have a data issue, and emails are lost. Phone calls or handwritten letters to your representatives count twice as much as an email. Okay. That's just the way it works. Because you can shoot off an email from a phone, but if you're irritated enough that you're going to call your congressman every morning, okay, they get that. Right here is the first list for Washington state legislators, and Tom Dent is on the ballot, so do make sure that you read that information. And Judy Warnick, I've met Judy Warnick before. She's all right. What the thing that is interesting is that they're here for you, which means you have to hold them accountable. Okay. So, and it doesn't matter what party, and I'll be very honest with this, because I'm a progressive lefty McLefterton, I guess, if you would. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So people in positions of power forget sometimes what they're there for, and they forget that they're public servants, right? Especially, I would say, in this day and age where it seems like there are no rules, but there are rules. Okay. And we as constituents believe in those rules because it's those rules that keep us safe and keep a power balance. Even though we know that those rules don't apply to everybody, even though we know that there are groups that are marginalized, like, we still have a faith system in that. And that's where the accountability comes in, is you call them, and if they don't listen, you take to the streets, you keep protesting. And that's what's really hard, is that there are so many people who will have to stand in Texas, give up a whole day of work to vote, to cast one vote, and hope that whoever they voted for saw that sacrifice and works for them. Okay. Some people will lose their job going to vote because their bosses won't give them the day off. Some people lose pay. Some people take great physical risks to do it. So, but it's one step. It's part of social justice, but the next step is the accountability from constituents, which are you. The minute you put that ballot in, you are a voting constituent. I love throwing that in their face. As a voting constituent, as a tax-paying constituent, I love to say, because you all know you paid more taxes than we all know who, and we all paid more taxes than Jeff Bezos did. So, but that's, again, another conversation for another day. So it's really important to take the fire and keep it burning, understanding that it's also for some of us, it's very tiring on our mental health. Okay, so you have those. You want to go to the next slide for me? Let's check that next slide. Here are more contacts. Oh, our bad. Maria Cantwell, Patty Murray, Kim Schreier. Maria Cantwell, she's fun. She loves numbers. She's kind of like a robot. Like, if you start talking to her about social justice stuff, she's like, okay. She does love a budget though. But accountability is the next step. So once you vote, it's keeping up with their track record. Now, in your voters pamphlet, again, it's very dry. It's very Metamucil-y, but you can actually look up. It has a list of the representatives. Sorry, that's stupid. I keep forgetting I'm on a phone and nobody can see me. It has a list of representatives and what they voted on for certain things. And you can absolutely look up the voters, your legislator, your representative's voter history. And because if they're telling you, you know, I support Black lives and I support gay lives, and then they turn around and take a bunch of lobbying money from Hobby Lobby and then they vote against gay marriage, they lied to you. They lied to me, you know? And so we have to hold them accountable by calling them, you know, by sending letters, by writing letters to the editor and putting that in newspapers, you know, having those newspapers then have them picked up by other newspapers. We have to do that. And it's very tiring. It's very tiring. It's time consuming, but I think we've all seen what happens when we don't. And the long-term systemic ramifications of complacency, especially complacency by the white voter. So it's very important to keep that fire lit. And for those with privilege to use their privilege to make sure that we can keep those fires so that those in marginalized groups have a chance to take a break, have a chance to, you know, take care of their mental health. We're all in this together, but certain groups are carrying a heavier burden. So that's kind of my voting spiel. I think I wasn't trying to fill out your ballot for you, but I mean, I have the answers to the test, but so if we have any questions, please let me know. I think we've got, and then we've got one more slide. You want to click that last one about the ballots. I love that all of you are not first-time voters. That's really perfect. So again, it's easiest if you drop your ballot off in front of the circ or in front of the courthouse. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And then I highly recommend getting used to just calling your representatives in the morning. Granted, you don't need to call them every day. Hey, Judy, what'd you have for breakfast? You don't need to do that. That's weird. But, you know, check in and just kind of keep an eye on what they're doing. Again, it can be really boring, but there are things that happen politically that will affect you, especially students. If this is like your first presidential election, the last 4 years have been dramatically impactful because it's literally been a compounding crisis every single day. But not all years are like that. So some years are easier to keep an eye on. So what we'll want to do is make sure that we are just keeping an eye on their voting record, making sure they're representing you, making sure that you feel like your voice is being heard, and then just keep it going. Like we've had a year of protests. Like I hope those protests don't end. Like we're still going to the protests because we still need to enact that change and have hope that change will be enacted. It takes a lot of work, and it can sometimes be really exhausting, because I can imagine, especially students right now, living through all of this. For some of you, this is your second economic crisis of your lifetime, and doing all of this schoolwork digitally and not having all of the support you need. So do keep the fire burning, so to speak. So let me know if we have any questions, if we have any other segues. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me here.
I think we do definitely have some questions for you. The chat has been filling up while you've been talking. Also, with ballot boxes too in the community, I wanted to note a couple things that I've learned this week. If anyone is nervous about going to turn in their ballot, or does not want to do it alone, or does not have a way to get their ballot to a ballot box, please contact us. Or also Ellensburg Calls to Action is having volunteers who are willing to accompany you to the ballot box, finding ways to just make sure everyone feels okay going to make their vote. So just to let you know, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. We'll do a little bit more at the end. But yeah, so there are ways to turn in your ballot if you're a little bit nervous about it. And if you're in a different community, there's also local like voter organizations who are going to be doing the same thing. So seek those out. They want you to contact them. So I would just recommend that before I pass it to Spencer to kind of start addressing some questions.
Awesome. That is some great information. I did not know that, Megan. I'm actually curious myself with COVID and everything going on, if there's going to be a way for people to not leave their house and somehow vote too, you know, with being afraid of getting out of the house. But before I switch gears and address some of the awesome questions that are popping up in the chat, while this Zoom room may be full of people that are not first-time voters, some people that may be watching this recording might be. So if you have any advice for a first-time voter, I'm curious to know, what is it?
My advice is to read the pamphlet and make your own decision. There are a lot of first-time voters, especially students, whose parents often will use you as a extra vote free card. It is your vote. It's not your parents' vote. It's not my vote. It's not your best friend's vote. It's your vote. My wife and I have been together for 13 years. Sorry, I was like, oh shit, I don't know how long we've been together. We don't always vote the same, but that's because there are some things we have different views on, and they are separate. So this is your voice and no one else. So, and if you have questions, there are a lot of non-conspiracy theorist websites that can tell you the information. Again, it's dry, you know, some of it's not super sexy, but I highly recommend doing it for you as an informed voter. This is your voice. Don't let somebody else make the decision for you.
As someone who's voted before, I can definitely say that some of those decisions can be pretty challenging to make. And you know, you're sitting there and you're juggling with the information. How do you go about determining hard decisions when you're voting?
For me, I look, I'm a very long-term thinker. I'm not the kind of person who has to have things right now. I also know that there's nothing in this world that is free, although some things should be provided for by the state. But everything has a price, and every good thing has a price, and every bad thing has a price. And so if I don't know what the right choice is, I try to look at what the ramifications could be a couple years out, right? So, you know, a school levy, and you're like, yeah, school levy, great. Sounds good. You know, as a first-time voter, I'd be like, yeah, school levy is great. You know, but as like a 15-year voter, I'm like, well, why do we have a school levy every year? What are we doing to this school? I have questions about how this bond money is being used. How much of the overhead is XYZ? You know, boring questions, but sometimes it's what does it look like on the, you know, what's it going to look like far out? And for some of them, you really have to say, does this affect me or does it affect my friend? Like, some people think it's totally fine to vote against the rights of other people because they have rights. So I have rights. So I don't think they don't see it as, well, I don't think you should have these rights, but that's the way it looks. I couldn't vote that way. And so for me, it's hard to understand how people can. And that's kind of where you really got to dig deep into your own personal belief system to also be like, okay, how does my vote impact possibly the next person? But again, now you're going into like the philosophies of like individuality. So sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes you're like, I have no idea, and I'm going to abstain from whatever this weird tax referendum is.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Leanna in the chat wants to know, can the ballot be dropped in the mailbox?
Sure can. No postage necessary if mailed in the US. Now, do keep in mind, you want to make sure that it has to be postmarked, which means it has to be in the mail by election date. Don't wait that long. So like I said, if you wanted to drop it off this Friday, you can absolutely make sure it's sealed and pop it right in your mailbox, and it will be delivered.
Awesome. Sydney wants to know, how did getting a college education change your views on politics and voting, if they did change at all?
Actually, that is a very good question, and that depends on the classes you take. It depends on what you can absorb and you're willing to absorb. That's actually a very good question, because a lot of parents will send their kids to school and they're like, you're coming back with a liberal arts education. And you're like, I'm learning math, Dad. It's okay. But it really depends on how open you are. I think had I not minored in sociology, I still would be pretty lefty, but I wouldn't know why. And I think that's the difference. It's not just that who you're voting for, but is it why? Do you have a fundamental basis for that decision making? And for me, that was vital. And I didn't realize, again, that was part of my privilege though. I'm cis presenting, and I'm a white girl. So I had a certain perceived notion of the world, and those classes allowed me to see something different. And that changed my idea of how my vote can be used to impact not just myself, but other minority groups. It's a good question. I hope I answered it, because sometimes I meander, so feel free to bat me back into the corner.
No problem. I think you answered the question just fine. Before we continue on, I'm going to circle back to Leanna's question of can the ballot be dropped in the mailbox? And Jamie wants to add to that. Why would you recommend a drop box over a mailbox?
Right now, I would only recommend the Dropbox. So because of the overwhelming impact that the new Postmaster General has had on the USPS. And I'm trying not to make it political, but it's political. The attack on the US Postal Service has been a political move. The US Postal Service is the longest existing agency in the United States, or I should say, white agency in the United States. That's why they call it the Pony Express. It was the first, I mean, if any of you've seen the movie The Postman, it's kind of like it, but it's the entity that kept white America building, because it kept everything connected. And it is a public service. It's not a profit generator. It's not, I think a lot of us take the mail for granted because we get crappy mail, you're just like, I don't want any of this. But the US Postal Service is a fundamental public service, and it is being attacked actively. And it's not that they're not trying to do their job. Every postman I've seen, every post person I've seen, they're on their grind trying to make sure everything's done, but they're overwhelmed. And so for me, it's just that I want to make sure that it's not going to get delayed anywhere. Now, if you put your ballot in by this Friday, it probably won't get delayed in Kittitas County. But we, I think, can say that in Washington State because our system is mail-in. Our system knows what it's doing. States that have never had mail-in ballots, that all of a sudden that's a huge inundation of mail. So I just like to be better safe than sorry. But if you're voting by Friday, we'll just pop that right in the mailbox. You should be good.
I have a quick question, and it's a little bit more about the USPS.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually saw today someone on a social media was sharing that the USPS actually sells its own products. I'm talking phone cases, sweatshirts, and that if you like in the same way of donating to a campaign, you can purchase these products to help with funding to USPS. I didn't know if that is correct.
Yeah, it's the same thing with stamps. If you buy something USPS, you're supporting USPS. And I love stamps. It's dumb, but I just like stamps. So I've always had stamps, and we always have stamps, but I totally went out and bought a bunch of new stamps. And then we sent little postcards to voters in different states, just being like, hey, we just want to make sure you vote, y'all, and just put it in there. So absolutely, if you can. And the problem is that we as taxpayers already fund the public, the USPS, and we are being asked to pay twice because somebody wants to privatize it. So it's things like that that can make young voters very jaded, because how, you're like, wait, I gotta pay for this twice? It's easy, but that's why when we vote people into power, we have to make sure that we keep them in check the whole way. Because I'm one of those people that if I have to follow the rules, you have to follow the rules. I, as a state worker, should not have more rules to follow than a federal representative, right? I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, it's fair to me, but so that's why accountability is so important for that. But yes, anything you purchase from USPS does fund USPS.
Interesting. I had no idea that they sold anything other than stamps. That's pretty cool. Jamie would like to know, why is this election so important? And what is at risk in our country based off of some of the candidates and some of the other, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the other, what do you call it, Joanna? You know.
Initiatives?
Yes, initiatives. Thank you.
Yeah. So I do not throw the term fascism around lightly. Okay. I'm not that kind of person. But for those of us who read a lot of history, and especially when people I know who love World War II and World War I history and don't see the parallels that we are already embroiled in, it's one thing to elect someone who wasn't elected, by the way, because Trump did not win the popular vote, who has no experience being a politician, which is a bad word, but it's also a very particular niche job. Okay. And there's a lot of gears that go into that. And there's a lot of logistics, and there's a lot, and the higher up, the bigger that umbrella gets. It's one thing to vote somebody in who doesn't have any qualifications. It's another for an entire political party to use that as a way to usurp the balance of power. Now, you can take any given day out of the last 4 years to research what that means, okay? Again, switching the Postmaster General at the last minute so that we can dismantle USPS before our major election. Not allowing USPS to send out masks. Not providing any sort of safety net for a nation in crisis during a global pandemic, taking those funds you have to bail out an airline company that doesn't need bailing out in the first place. Okay, so, and this is literally just the last 6 months, okay? But it's not just the blatant disregard of power. It's the consolidation of power into one entity. That's problematic. I'm not in love with Joe Biden, okay? I do love the fact that he said it's a big fucking deal, because it's a big fucking deal. I think it's funny. I think he's a funny old man. He shouldn't be touching women when they didn't say so. Okay, that is also problematic. I'm not saying he's not problematic. But as that one video said, I'm trying to get on the bus that's going to take me closest to my house. Okay, one of the buses is on fire headed towards a pit. Okay, I want to go to my house. Okay, so when you consolidate so much power into one entity, you dismantle the other checks and balances. Okay, trying to not allowing Barack Obama to appoint a constitutionally allowed Supreme Court justice in an election year, but turning around and saying that Trump should be able to less than 30 days before an election is not only blatant systematic racism, okay, but again, certain rules exist for certain parties and certain people. This is a consolidation of power. That's the problem. And we've been so overwhelmed as a nation and as a people with crises happen every day. I can imagine, I don't know if you feel it, but I feel like I'm a raw nerve every morning. And it's not just the doom scrolling, and it's not just the homework, and it's not just that for some reason my student loan bills are still due. I don't understand. We're in a pandemic. Why are you bothering me? But there's a crisis every day. And that is a tactic to wear people down, because then at some point be like, well, it doesn't matter who I vote for. Well, that's what they want you to think. Because if we can consolidate enough power, it doesn't matter who you vote for, because I won't leave anyways. So it's important, because we need to elect people who we can hold accountable and who will follow the rule of law. Now, I say that, again, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. So you still have to hold them accountable. but at least Joe apologizes for his mistakes and listens to science, right? I need to start somewhere, and that's the bus going closest to my house. But it is the consolidation of power and the rise in fascism that is the biggest scare. And some people don't take that seriously, and y'all can do with that what you want, but I highly suggest looking, a lot of people don't know what the word fascism means. Look it up, look at the historical references to fascism, and then if you've got the stomach and the mental health capacity, look at those parallels that we're dealing with now. The problem is we're all tired. I'm tired, and I can't imagine as students how tired you must be in all of this, and to be quarantined, and to be lonely, and to have like 1,800 hours of homework every week. So long story short, that's why it's an important election, I would say large scale, but it's always an important election in your local communities, because those are the impacts that hit you first. So always take your time to read your pamphlet.
I have a couple questions that have come to me while you've been talking, and I feel like this is really relevant to what we're discussing now too, especially with the mix of who we currently have in leadership and then also voter suppression. But could you explain the concept of gerrymandering?
Yes, I love gerrymandering, and that I hate gerrymandering. Okay, so gerrymandering is when politicians rewrite the shape of a voter's district in order to rig the votes a particular way. For example, Kittitas County was gerrymandered several years ago. What they did to Kittitas County was, I almost went in this map. I don't have a map, but okay. So here's the mountains. Okay, here's the mountains. Let's say this is Ellensburg. Sorry, I'm not very good with right to left, so even backwards this is worth. Okay, so here's Ellensburg, right? We almost flipped the county blue one year. That's a pretty big deal, because Kittitas is conservative, but not as conservative as you think, right? So here we are, Kittitas. Our legislators went over here, crossed the mountains, and added a little pocket, Red County, right here. And some of you are like, Joanna, this map doesn't make sense. But what that did was, by adding this little pocket of conservatives on the west side of the mountains, it made it almost impossible to flip Kittitas County. We changed the shape of our district to add the voters we wanted to add to get a particular outcome. That is gerrymandering. Instead of people voting for who they want as representatives, the representatives rewrite the map to choose their voters. That's kind of fucked up. I think it is. I think it's absolutely. And it is most historically done in Black neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, minority neighborhoods, so that they can never pick their representative. Their representative just cuts their communities apart to have their voters. It is also done, it's called redlining, it's also done in economic terms. So because they've rigged this one particular area as a voting system, that often affects how banks will relinquish loans, and it almost always negatively affects families of color. So I hate gerrymandering. You should too. Most people are victims of gerrymandering and they don't realize it because it's part of their privilege. So.
And we can change that by voting people into office who then can outlaw that. Is that how we would affect change in that direction?
But for in terms of gerrymandering, that is something, again, that's systematic. That is systematic racism, and it has been based on systematic racism. There was a Supreme Court case. I don't think it was federal, but I think it was a state Supreme Court case that decided that the Republicans who illegally gerrymandered, they were like, yeah, it wasn't right, but we'll let it stand. How helpful is it as a young voter to see that the state Supreme Court allows that behavior? Right? So I say it's so easy to get disillusioned about voting, because that's the first step. Because then you call and you're like, hey, this is wrong. And I'm going to call you every day. And I'm going to donate money to whoever ends gerrymandering. They listen to money, right? And I'll be honest, I don't know how many of you have received 1,800 text messages from Joe Biden. I love you, Joe Biden, but if I swear to God I get one more text message, I may just throw my phone out a window. But it's not, you can't be a voter. You can't donate every day. I don't know about you, but I'm too poor for that. I don't have the kind of money for that. But I'll call you every day and tell you that I think it's absolutely absurd that it's 2020 and you are supporting a systematic racist system like gerrymandering, and tell it how it is. I tell them right to their face, oh, so you support systemic racism? Why would that be? And just let them swim in it. I love making people uncomfortable about their racism. So I have no problem calling up, being like, we need to talk about this. And that's exactly how you do it. You vote for people, and then you consistently say, we're done with this. We are tired of our legislators deciding who their constituents are and not the other way around. That's a good question.
I know at Central last year, they were talking about, students were talking about, in regards to gerrymandering, is that students, when they're in school over in Ellensburg, that they change where they vote so that they can vote in the local elections in the county, so that it will help affect their education and really overturn the gerrymandering that's happened in our county.
It really does. Washington State is blue because of Kittitas. Not because of Kittitas. I misspoke. You and I know that's not right. Because of King, Snohomish, and Pierce County. That's why. Washington State is pretty conservative. And it's because we're so close to Idaho. Yes, when students come to Ellensburg, I always suggest they register to vote as Kittitas being their county of voting. Because not only does it help the census data, but it gives more educational tax dollars to this county. And sorry, we need that tax money. You got to pay to play. But you have more of an impact as a progressive voter over here than you would say at where your parents live in like King County. So
I think when we had a speaker last year, students were shocked to find out that that the county government has not given permits to Central in order to have a parking garage, like a multi-level, because they make a lot of money off tickets, off of students and other things. And so it might have been you when you came in and taught to my class, but the thing was, if they want to do something about it, they need to register in our county and re-elect those officials, or at least be able to have a say in the things that are being done against students within even our local government.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we have a lot of West Side students who are used to space, who aren't used to being over here. And a lot of people don't like the concept of paying for parking. Well, too bad. There's a finite amount of space. And again, we're in a small town, but that's a good example of a tiered parking lot. Even though this is campus property, the city is not going to let that stand. But I think there's a lot of coding issues. And again, it's not sexy, but when you know why your local government won't do things, and then you're like, oh, well, that's weird because you're going against everything you say you support. That's when you can hold them accountable. And again, your vote, I feel like the votes here are so much bigger because they have that lasting impact. I was interviewed for a thing about the Downtown Business Association, and they asked me, well, Joanna, what would, as a queer person in our community, what would impact you to spend more money? And I was like, well, maybe not having your businesses be so racist and homophobic would be a start. Weird. Like, I can control how I vote, but I can't control the businesses who want to call me a dyke when I walk in. But again, you want my money. It's kind of like politicians. You want my vote, but then you're going to vote against me and treat me like crap. No, that's not how this works. And that sure as hell isn't how it works with me. So my wife just tweeted something about me, and it popped up on my phone. But it's that you got to vote and you got to hold them accountable. And it's as easy as making a phone call in the morning.
So I do you want to, there's still some questions in the chat, and I wanted to know, we usually wrap up around 8, but would you be willing to stay on a little bit longer and answer
Wow.
some questions?
Yeah, I've got a little more battery life, Julie.
Okay. But I do, if anyone has to leave, I'm just gonna share my screen really quick.
Can I say something while you're doing that?
Yeah.
Do it.
Joanna, your wife just tweeted, listening to my wife present to a class and she's doing great, and I'm resisting the urge to bust through the wall like the Kool-Aid man yelling about Elbridge Jerry. I had to look.
She's totally in the other room listening to me. Oh, that looks great.
Perfect. Yes. So next week, same time, we're going to be doing a nonprofit basics workshop with Jamie and I. But combined with that, we are also going to be celebrating Halloween in a perfectly nice, socially distant way. So you can bring your best virtual backgrounds, your spookiest, your scariest, and you can dress up if you would like to. I know there's a few of us that are already planning our costumes because for me, this will be my only Halloween event. So,
Social media tease.
and we'll be teasing on social media about our officers throughout the week about what we'll be dressing up as. But it's not required to dress up. You can just attend, but prizes will be awarded for the best ones. As always, just feedback is valued. So we will send out our feedback link in an email. And if you have kind of your key takeaways from events like these and maybe more issues that you want talked about, please share them with us here so we can plan more talks that are directed towards what you want to hear about. So I just wanted to share that in case anyone does have to hop out before we finish answering some questions. So there's a couple in here, honestly, about ballot boxes that I think really are important to be answered. One was actually, if I'm a student who's voting from another county, will my ballot still be counted if I turn it in an Ellensburg ballot box, or do I need to mail it?
Mail it.
Okay.
And I only say that because, let me look at the front. Let me read it. I could also always just ask Jen. That's a good question. Can we research that and then send that answer out?
Yes,
because
we can definitely.
I don't want to make you mail it if you don't need to. But I also don't want you to put it in the ballot box and have them freak out. If I'm right, you can just drop it off in the ballot box. But let me get an answer back to you, Megan, and then you can send it out to the group if that works.
That works perfect.
Yep.
Yes. We also have a question. It says, because of the recent worries about drop boxes being removed, USPS funding cut short, delivery not being reliable as normal because of COVID and other factors that are interfering, how can you guarantee or even check that your ballot gets delivered?
Oh, there's a thing for that. And you know what? Let's get the answer to that too. Because a friend of mine just voted the week before, because they got their ballots a little bit earlier, and she was able to track that it had been received at the election check site. So I know there is an absolute way, and let me find that. And then if there's a link, we will send that link out with the information. That way you just have it. That's a very good question.
And along with, so we'll be sharing some of the slides that we shared tonight about common mistakes, about contacting your legislators, but we'll also be sharing the link where if you come from a different county, where you can find the representatives for like your district, for your area, so you know what applies to you and how to contact. I do have to tell you, just putting together those slides was a pain to find out the best ways to contact my legislators. They do not make it easy, and it's for a reason.
Exactly. They don't want you to hold them accountable. Do you think Reichardt wanted to hear me like flush the toilet every morning? No. Did I love it because I'm petty? Yes, I did. Serves you right for being a shitty legislature.
And so we'll be sending that out along with like links and information and ways to find this, so it makes it easier for you, so you don't have to sit through like the hours that I did trying to find it. But we also have a question from Ruby.
Yes.
And she says, if I'm not sure if you're super familiar with Yakima County, but in Yakima County versus Kittitas County, where do you think a blue vote would make the most difference?
Oh, great question.
That is a great question, and I'd say between the two counties, that'd be a dealer's choice. Yakima is surprisingly conservative. Well, not really. But it kind of depends on what's on the ballot in Yakima. But and the thing is you wouldn't be able, like, if there's something of concern in Yakima, like if you spend a lot of your time in Yakima, I'd say wherever you are the most and you pay the most tax dollars, that's where I would vote. Because yeah, that's a really good question. I would say wherever you would spend 75% of your residency or wherever you live. So like if I was working in Yakima, but I lived in Ellensburg, I'd still vote in Ellensburg. But if you live in Yakima and you commute to Ellensburg, I would vote in Yakima. Good question.
I also had some information that was shared by Deanna, and she was talking about Pell Grants and like your loans and everything. So students receive Pell Grants should be aware that their funding is partially funded by the U.S. Senate discretionary funding. If students aren't happy with their Pell federal funding, they need to vote for U.S. senators that understand the value Pell funding provides to low-income students. Alongside that, also federal loan rates are determined by U.S. Congress members. So just some information as you are either accessing financial aid or you're thinking about others who are accessing financial aid. That's a way that we can hold that process accountable.
Yes. I would like to interject real quick. I'd like to apologize for all the weird faces I'm making. I just remembered that this is being recorded, so whoever's watching this. B, on page 6 of your Washington State voters pamphlet, it says in box 4, to check the status of your ballot, go to votewa.gov.
Push it closer to the camera.
Oh. Well, that's not super helpful. Well, we'll screenshot it for you, but it's on page
What
6.
page? I got mine.
Page 6, box 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. That's exactly. So votewa.gov, and you'll be able to track your status, the status of your ballot. So whoever asked the tracking of status, that's a very good question. Like I said, it's a real dull read, this voters pamphlet, but it's got some of the gems that you need in it, definitely. Any more questions?
I'm going to share something in the chat too. Deanna loved how you described gerrymandering. She felt like it was very effective, and she wanted to share a video that kind of supplies even more information for that. So I just put that in the chat.
Highly
recommend. Look. Some more current information too on voter suppression and kind of what's happening in the country right now. There was a situation in Florida, and she shared an article with us that she wanted you guys to have and see.
I wonder if it's the same Florida article we were talking about earlier.
The one where the policeman was wearing a Trump mask?
Oh no, that's even better. Oh good, there's more than one. See, there's a crisis. There's multiple crises a day. How can we keep them all straight?
Yes. I'm just reviewing kind of our questions, making sure we got everything answered. Is there anyone else who had a question that kind of popped up in the last couple minutes?
I can have one more thing I'd like to ask.
Okay.
So I definitely have these friends, right, that think they're totally making this badass, awesome statement by not voting, and they felt that way for a long time. And I've had multiple discussions, and it's not just them. I've also ran into some students that feel this way too. And I'm curious if you've ever experienced an interaction with somebody that felt this way, and how did you persuade them to vote?
That's a good question, because that's really hard, because a lot of people don't want to vote because A, they're disillusioned, or B, they want attention. saying, well, I don't want to vote. No one's good. First of all, there's no perfect candidate, and the good dies in the attempt at perfection. So it's really hard to convince somebody who doesn't think voting is important that their voice matters. Usually I like to ask, who hurt you? Because usually it has something to do with they don't think they can enact change. Also, I think part of them realizes that, again, that's step one of the process. But initially, when in my youth, I'd say, if you don't vote, don't bitch. If you didn't vote, you are part of the problem. A no vote is a no vote. And so what it means is that you weren't willing to step outside of your comfort zone for a few minutes to think of how other people might be impacted by your vote. And 9 times out of 10, those voters are white, usually statistically, because there's a privilege component based in there as well. Anyone who has had ancestors die for the right to vote, anyone who has had grandmothers segregated and not allowed to vote will vote. People who know what it's like to have your rights swept away one morning because 2 old dudes who wear black robes just think that religious people should be able to tell me that my marriage isn't valid. They can vote. My vote counts. And so usually people who don't want to vote, it's one of those 2 reasons. There's a lot of disillusionment, or there's just a complete lack of empathy on thinking of anybody but themselves, and they don't think, well, it's not going to impact me. How very selfish of you. It'll impact a lot of the people you know. So thanks. And that, for some people, it tells me everything I need to know about them.
Dylan, did that kind of answer your question as well? Because he had a similar. Your Bernie's on upside down, just by the way. Just want to announce that.
Can you see it now? Oh, that's okay. It kind of answered my question. I was just curious how, like, what your response would be to someone who's like, oh, I'm a third party, I'm a green party, but like, now I have to vote for these 2. Like, I have no choice. Like, how do you?
And that's a very good question, because I've heard that a lot. They're like, well, why should I have to vote? Look, life's not fair. Get over it. I need you to pick the lesser of 2 evils. And the thing is you can't just drop a third party candidate into a presidential election. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you. What you need to do is you need to vote third party for your local elections. And then vote third party for your state elections. And then vote through. The thing is the third party just kind of hangs out there over here, and then they just show up at the presidential election like, hey, third party. And you're like, this has been a party for 4 years. Where you been this whole time? I'm not saying don't vote third party. If you're going to be a third party voter, vote third party. Grassroots, activate for a third party. Generate other votes for third party, starting in your local elections. Okay. Now, this year is not the time to be voting third party for the presidential election. And I don't mean to say that, you have to vote for Joe Biden, but look, you're voting against fascism. Do you want to vote against fascism, or do you want to give your vote to somebody none of us has ever heard of? Okay. And that's kind of what it's boiling down to. I do not believe that a 2-party system has benefited the United States at all. Okay. It's not perfect, but that's why we need to vote blue right now and then say, Joe, I need you to be greener. I need you to actually bring these third-party candidates as part of your team. And this is what we expect. And then you send them information and you call them and you say, we have a local third-party person and I want them to be involved. And then you vote them in your local elections. Absolutely vote third party. Just not today. Just not right now. Okay. But I swear, I firmly believe that there's a lot of good. And I think if we had a multi-party system that actually worked, we wouldn't be as polarized as we are. But That's why you got to get in there and then bring the third party in. Okay, that would be my selection, my suggestion, but not today. I'm sorry. Like they're like no. And in this particular situation, you need people who have been in there and who have the chops to fix a lot of logistics and a lot of large scale infrastructure problems. And the green and a lot of the third parties don't have the infrastructure in place for that yet. But again, if you vote locally to get them there, you can change that.
And especially educating other voters on like the benefits like of a multi-party system or like voting third party locally, because when I was growing up and I was taking poli-sci 101, I was just told that 3 parties would never work. It will never work for America, and not to question it, and that it was a 2-party system. So I think
that's because it was based on a good party bad party idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like as opposed to actually multiple parties, that if you had multiple parties, you would have a better representative legislature of your actual constituency base.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have answered all of the questions. I thank you so much for coming and sharing with us and giving us this knowledge, and also for staying later and answering more questions, because yeah, this is just such, I feel like, a good place. Voting can be, it's very political, there's a lot of question, there's a lot of misdirection, and so to have a place where students can come and just genuinely ask questions about what to do and what not to do, I think was really great. So we really appreciate having you here.
Absolutely. And if you want to give me 1 second, we can answer that last question about if they can drop ballots anywhere. Let me knock on the wall. I'll be right back. I gotta go to space.
We got to create a sound effect.
Yeah.
Oh shit. Okay. That's okay. I've never had that question. I told him we email him tomorrow. Okay. Just kidding. That's such a good question. Neither one of us know the answer to it. So we're going to make sure we're going to figure out the information. It's probably at votelaw.gov, but just in case, we'll look it up, and then we'll have you email it out as a yes or no. If you live in a different county, can you plop your ballot in our box? So we'll get that answer for you.
Joanna, I just want to say that Jackson, who asked that question, was in my First Amendment class last year when you came in and spoke.
Oh, nice. Good.
And he privately messaged me saying he was so excited that he stumped the voting queen.
No, that was I even was like, hey, you know this answer? And she was like, I do not. So well played. Stumped both of us. So
good job, Jackson.
Well, your students had a lot of very good questions tonight. And a lot of people are like, I don't want to get involved in politics. Baby, politics are involved in you, whether you want it to be or not. And other people's politics are involved with you. And so politics are very personal, especially for people who are in marginalized groups. And that's why those who aren't in marginalized groups, it's a way for them to very easily use their privilege to lift others. And so sometimes your vote isn't just for you. It's for your community. It's for your people. It's for your nation. And when people say, oh, patriotism, a way to be really patriotic is to vote and to secure the right to vote for other people. So I appreciate all of your good questions. I appreciate your passion. And I am very excited to make sure that all of you have voted by Friday.